Hello and welcome back for another episode of Leadership that Liberates. So, last time I spoke a lot about martyrdom and saviorism and the ways in which our desire to be good has really been shaped by oppressive systems, and the ways in which we perform goodness can actually be extractive or exploitative. And again, this is happening in an unconscious way, right? Because our intention is to do good. And oftentimes, the unintended consequence of that is harm. And at one point in my life, this was the way that I myself operated. I very much martyred myself and tried to save other people. And I've been having conversations with a friend actually in the last couple of days, and the ways that this is showing up in people that we know, and how we can see parts of ourselves reflected in the ways in which these people are behaving, because at one point in time, we did the same things. And I remember when I had to confront for myself what I was doing and the deeper reasons I was doing it, it was very uncomfortable for me. And in so many ways, we are conditioned to operate like this, to think like this. And so I today want to really focus on how does that show up and play out on a bigger scale collectively. And in my own experience with international development and humanitarian aid, this is really a system within which martyrdom and saviorism show up in ways that, again, are driven by a desire to do good, but oftentimes result in harm. And so, again, I'm going to start from my own personal experience because this was my mode of operation at one point in my life. And I think about the ways in which we internalize a lot of messages about who in the world is civilized or modern, or what nations are developed versus undeveloped. A lot of these narratives, we grow up hearing them, and they are embedded in our ways of thinking about our positionality within the world. Who are we in relation to other people? And who are other people compared to us? I mentioned in last week's episode around how a lot of this has been shaped by colonialism and the relationship between colonialism and religion, and primarily missionary work. And so we look at, first of all, the white man's burden, which was this idea coming out of Europe in the late 1800s, I think it was, that that white people were somehow superior to people in the rest of the world, and that they had this moral obligation and duty to civilize the rest of the world. And so colonialism was very much built upon or justified through this idea of the white man's burden. And then you had something that played out in the US called Manifest Destiny, which was basically a reiteration of the white man's burden, but it was that white people and the settlers were destined, they were given divine instruction to civilize the rest of the Americas through colonization. Now, in many ways, these narratives, this kind of logic, this discourse is embedded into the ways that we think about ourselves in relation to the rest of the world. And so people from the global north, what used to be called the West, and before that, what was called the First World, people from these parts of the world, regardless of race or identity, are often conditioned to think about themselves as more modern, more progressed, more civilized. And folks in the global south, South America, Africa, Asia, they are perceived to be somehow less than. And we don't necessarily use that language, but we talk about them as needing help. They need our help. And it is somehow our moral obligation or our moral duty to provide that help, to quote unquote save them from their circumstances. But what if we are the ones who created those circumstances? And that's exactly what we're going to talk about. So, when I was younger, I very much had internalized this way of thinking about the world. And I, in my martyrdom and saviorism, wanted to go out into the world and to help people. And I really had this kind of naive notion that I was going to save the world, or that I had the ability to save the world in some sense. When I graduated college, so I knew that I wanted to go to grad school, but I wasn't exactly sure at that point what I wanted to study. And I did know that I wanted to take a gap year. And what I decided to do in part of that gap year was go to Tanzania to teach English. And this was very much rooted in white saviorism, which again, you don't actually need to be white or white passing to have this kind of mentality or this way of thinking about yourself in relation to others. It is very much put into us as folks from the global north. So we are very much indoctrinated into this way of thinking because of these discourses and narratives like the white man's burden and manifest destiny. So I thought, yes, I'm going to do this incredibly noble, self-sacrificial thing and go help these people in this poor country. And there are just like so many things that are problematic about this. But at the time, I couldn't fully see that. And if I'm honest with myself, unconsciously, there was a desire to be praised for this decision and to be envied for this decision. Look at how good she is. Look at how amazing she is. This was very much rooted in my desire to be seen as a good person. And I was very much performing goodness. But at the time, in my heart, I really believed that I was being good and that I was doing good. And so I arrive in Tanzania, and there are so many things about that experience that completely rattled my personal sense of reality and what I had believed to be true up until that point about the way the world works. And so when I was in Tanzania, I lived with a local family. Well, they were a couple, a married couple. Bibi and Babu is what I called them. So that's grandmother and grandfather. Bibi and Babu were in their 70s when I was there. And they had grown adult children who didn't live in the house with them, but they had taken in several individuals who were between the ages of 20 and 30. I think there were like 6 or 7 different people who were kind of working for them, and they owned a school. And so I was teaching at the school that Bibi and Babu owned. And it was just so interesting to me to see the ways in which I was treated, first of all, simply because I was white and from the United States, from the global north. So there was automatically in place with me and the other staff at the school this power imbalance that really took effect immediately, where it was like I was somehow seen and treated as superior, while at the same time there was this underlying resentment toward me. And first of all, it was just very uncomfortable as a 20-year-old who is not qualified in any kind of way to be given the type of authority that I was, and the ways in which so many local staff almost like resigned themselves to me as if I knew best. There was like an assumption that I knew better than everybody else, which is so far from the truth. But the longer that I stayed there, the more that I understood that these dynamics were part of the way in which our world had been shaped and the ways in which they also had been conditioned to think about themselves in relation to everyone else. And of course, there were people who didn't buy into that and who could see beyond that kind of discourse. But there were a lot of people who had also internalized this oppression and had internalized a sense of inferiority, as though they somehow were less than me because they had been taught to think of themselves in that way through the ways in which colonialism continued to live on. And it was interesting because Bibi and Babu would often have these discussions or arguments about this because Babu had worked for the British government. And he, in many ways, I would say, was kind of quote unquote bought into the ways in which Tanzania needed the British to help them. And Bibi, on the other hand, was very outspoken against this. And she had worked in the Tanzanian parliament And she had actually a few times attempted assassinations. People had tried to kill her because she was very outspoken about the corruption within the government. She was very outspoken about the ways in which these colonial frameworks were continuing to cause harm for local populations. And there were a lot of people which found she was stirring up, right, these problems for people. And so they had tried to assassinate her on multiple occasions. And Bibi and Babu would have these discussions, these arguments where Babu would say something that basically hinted toward the value that British colonialism brought to Tanzania. And Bibi would say, "You're such a fool." Like she would always call him a fool and talk about how we didn't need the British and their potatoes, like we were fine without the potatoes. Because Babu, the work that he had done was connected to farming and agriculture. And so Bibi was always like, we don't need the British and their potatoes. We were fine before we had potatoes. And yeah, and so I would just, kind of observe these dialogues between them and the ways in which things were happening in the school and the ways that I was treated. And I started to notice things too, like I would go into the store and all the makeup would be for people with white colored skin. All the band-aids were for white colored skin. And I just was like, what, this is so weird because I didn't really have an understanding at that time. I was like 22, I think. 21 or 22. So I didn't have an understanding of what had really happened through colonialism and the impact that it had around the world because we never learned any of that stuff when I was in school. I didn't even really know the reality of what had happened to Indigenous peoples until I was in 11th or 12th grade. And we read a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. And it was all about all of the things we had never been taught up until that point, all of the things that had been excluded from our education and our curriculums. And so for me, this was very eye-opening. I wasn't aware of the ways in which people around the world had been disempowered through this process and this system of colonialism. And I didn't realize the extent to which people around the world had internalized the saviorism and martyrdom of the global north as something which made them less than and in need of help, and in many cases created dependency on development and aid. It was in this span of this gap year that I decided I wanted to get a master's in cultural anthropology. And so I enrolled in my program and I was studying religious-based war and conflict and the role of religious identity in international war and civil conflict around the world. But I also was now, because of my experience in Tanzania, I was very interested in international development. And again, I think I had this naive notion that I was somehow going to change the way in which this system worked. And so while I was in this graduate program, I also enrolled in an additional certification in international development studies. And so I started to study the international development system and humanitarian aid. I was in the anthropology program, and also this certification took a very post-colonial perspective. And so they were very much teaching us about the impacts of colonialism and the ways in which that way of thinking has been conditioned into us. And also through this certification program on international development studies, I was learning about the origins of the international development system. And essentially, that paradigm of the global north helping and offering aid to the global south was born out of something called the Bretton Woods Conference that happened toward the end of World War II. And the intention of this conference, this gathering of 44 allied nations, the intention was to ensure global economic stability following the war and to prevent economic instability that had led to the Great Depression, which played a role in the unfolding of World War II. And it was through the Bretton Woods Conference that the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were created. And these are institutions which have in many ways been responsible for this division between the global north and the global south in terms of Who is the provider, the savior, the helper, and who is the recipient, the dependent, the one that is in need of saving or helping? And so these institutions basically systematized these discourses and these dialogues related to ideologies like the white man's burden and manifest destiny. So these ideologies were already in place. These discourses around who was more modern, more civilized, these ways of thinking about the world already existed. But through the World Bank and the IMF, they were put into a system. And it is through this system that we basically had the creation of first world countries, second world countries, third world countries. A Colombian anthropologist, Arturo Escobar, who talks a lot about this, especially in his work Encountering Development. He talks about the ways in which the discourse around development created the idea of the third world, that there wasn't actually a third world. It was through this discourse that came to be. And so the global north didn't just help the global south, it directly created the global south. So Escobar argued that the third world didn't just exist, but rather it was a category that was created through this discourse about what counts as developed versus undeveloped. Then we have another scholar, Walter Rodney, who was from Guyana, and he was a historian. And he argued that underdevelopment isn't just a reflection of a lack of a development. It is actually the result of exploitative relationships between the global north and the global south. That actually parts of the world like South America and Asia and Africa are underdeveloped because of this exploitation of the global north. And so in many ways, what the IMF and the World Bank did was replace colonialism. And so what you have through international development and humanitarian aid is a neocolonial framework where the global north is exploiting the global south, leading to its dependence on the resources of the global north, because the global north has effectively removed their agency and autonomy and disempowered them through these power dynamics. Many folks in these parts of the world struggle to survive directly because of the policies and practices that are implemented by the global north and these exploitative relationships. And so much of this is happening and being perpetuated because of the saviorism and martyrdom of the folks from the global north wanting to help and save and fix the global south. There are so many people entering these fields with the same desires and motivations that drove me when I was a 20-year-old, because we are operating on this naive notion that we are going to help, that we are going to somehow save. But what actually happens is we create more harm. So a lot of people are entering these fields driven by martyrdom and saviorism. And the idea is that somehow, because we're coming from countries that are quote unquote more civilized, more developed, more progressed, that we then have the answers or the solutions to the problems of those countries, which are somehow less than backward, uncivilized, undeveloped, not yet modern. And again, all of this language is rooted in these problematic power dynamics. But very often that is not seen or understood by the people who are desiring with good intentions to help. But then they are unconsciously replicating and perpetuating these harmful systems. And so something that I would see all the time in studying this is the ways in which these projects for development would be implemented. Again, on the basis that there is one group of people who knows better and can teach this other group of people how to do better. And so you would have these projects that did not take into account or consideration local history, local cultural context, people's needs, people's actual needs. Nobody was actually asking people, what do you need? There was this very top-down approach to international development and humanitarian aid, where there was an assumption that one side knew what the other side needed and imposed that knowing. And then you would have projects be replicated again without consideration of local context. And so something that was being implemented in Malawi would then be implemented in Myanmar, would then be implemented in Paraguay. But again, it's like every place has a different history, a different context, a different culture. And so these projects ultimately would fail because they weren't accounting for people's actual needs. And you have within this system of international development and humanitarian aid this constant sense of urgency and this desire to do everything in the quickest, most efficient way possible, right? Where we spend the least amount of money and the least amount of resources possible. And this is another reason why projects fail. Because to actually engage with people and to actually understand what they need and what they want, and to actually treat them as the authorities over their own lives and communities, that takes more time, that takes more effort, that takes more resources. And so it isn't a quote unquote easy fix or solution. And so there actually is no solution. The quote unquote solutions which are being implemented are not in any way effective or sustainable. And so in the long run, it's actually a waste of time, a waste of money, a waste of resources. And it perpetuates these dynamics of dependency. Like you have people dropping bags of rice in Vietnam, which is one of the world's top rice producing countries in the world. They don't need rice from the global north. But over time, what happens is that through this kind of aid, people stop producing. And over time, it creates a dependency because people have lost touch with the ways in which they can actually care for themselves, because they do have the ability and the capacity and the knowledge to care for themselves. But over time, through these systems, they have been stripped of their agency and their autonomy. And they are being told what to do and how to do it by people who think they know better. And there's like all of this kind of discourse and narrative around performing goodness that we talked about in last week's episode that is now playing out globally through these systems on a massive scale that is leading to more and more inequalities around the world. And again, if we're thinking about what is actually unconsciously going on here, it is all rooted in lack and in this deeper belief that some people are less than others and they need to be helped and fixed and saved. Or because I somehow unconsciously believe that I am less than, then I have to prove what a good person I am through the helping and the saving and the fixing of other people, of other groups, of other countries. And something that was very interesting that I saw playing out just in this year was when the Trump administration issued executive orders to cut funding for USAID, USIP, like all of these different organizations which operate within this system. And the funding was cut and projects were decimated, which was problematic. Okay, so on the one hand, it's like we need to dismantle these systems. And on the other hand, the way by which we do that really matters because it is true. A system of dependency has been created. So there are now people around the world who depend on this funding to live and to survive. And to just from one day to the next cut the funding really impacts people in detrimental ways across the world. So the way in which this system is currently collapsing is very problematic. And it is a collapse which has needed to happen for a very long time. It's just that the way in which it's happening now is creating a lot of suffering and death because of the ways in which these systems have operated for so long. And this was like a conversation we were always having when I was in graduate school. Is it even possible to decolonize international development and humanitarian aid when it is inherently colonial? It is a neocolonial system structure framework. So can we actually decolonize something that could not exist without a colonial ideology? And this is why a lot of people have been talking about we can't actually reform this system. We have to create a new alternative. We have to do something totally different. We can't just reform the process in place. And so what's happened with these funding cuts and with tens of thousands of people being laid off who were working within this system I saw, because I have the majority, not maybe not the majority, but I would say like 50 to 60% of my network on LinkedIn are people who have worked in these systems. And so what you could see was almost like this divide in the discourse between people who were losing their jobs. And you had some people who were like, how are we going to leverage this moment as an opportunity to create the change we have so desperately desired to see in this field? Because there are so many people who have recognized the problems within this space and how they play out in day-to-day life for so many people around the world. And then you had this other side of people who were clinging to the goodness that these systems have done, to how important this work is, how necessary and needed it is. The thing is that it's only necessary and needed because it has been designed to create the conditions in which it has become necessary and needed, but not because it actually inherently is needed. And I'm not saying that there is no good that has come out of international development and humanitarian aid. It has served and supported people to different degrees, but it has also created a great deal of harm. And so while some people see this as an opportunity for change, there are other people who remain entrenched in saviorism and martyrdom who would cling to the system as it has been because they really believe in the goodness of the system. Because to acknowledge that the system is problematic would require us then to confront the fact that we have been complicit in the problems created by the system, that we ourselves have also played into problematic dynamics, that we have fed into the disempowerment of the people we have set out to help. And if we are not able to confront these problematic dynamics within our own lives and how they play out in our own relationships, how could we possibly acknowledge and admit how we have contributed to global systems of inequality, of extraction, of exploitation? So many of us are unable to admit the ways in which this plays out in our own personal relationships. How could we possibly admit to ourselves that we have contributed to harm on such a large scale through our martyrdom and our saviorism, and the ways in which we perform goodness to unconsciously meet our own sense of lack, our own internal insufficiency? And this is again an invitation into honoring our own humanity and the humanity of others. Am I actually honoring someone else's humanity, their sovereignty, their agency, their autonomy, when I tell them I know better than you how to fix your problem? Actually, I know what your problem is, and you don't even know what it is. And so I am going to tell you the solution, and you should listen to me. So after I left grad school and I ended up working for the Jump Foundation, we were connected to an organization called Learning Service. And this organization's intention was to kind of flip the idea of service learning on its head. And service learning is something that's very common within the international school system. And it's where students go into local communities around the world and they do these service learning projects. So they're like helping. It's just like a miniature version of international development and humanitarian aid. And this organization, Learning Service, their intention was to invite us into questioning the dynamics that were playing out through these kinds of volunteer projects. So, what if we're not service learning, but we're learning service? I took a lot of their teachings and their frameworks and I started sharing them with student groups that I was working with. And then when I went on to work at Florida State University, I was working with a student organization that was also doing these kind of volunteer projects abroad. And I was teaching them the learning service frameworks. And essentially, the idea is that we are learning to serve. So it's an approach that is meant to center the wisdom, the agency, the autonomy, the sovereignty, the knowledge, the knowing of local populations. They are the ones that know what problems they are facing. They are the ones that deeply understand the challenges before them. And they are the ones that understand the context within which they are operating. They are also the ones that have the solutions. to their problems. And so through learning service, it's how do I learn to serve those people in ways that are needed as defined by them. So it's not that I come in and I say, here's what you need, here's how I can help you from my framework, from a Western way of looking at the world, from a perspective that is rooted in the values and the practices of the global north, but rather, what is it that you need and how can I be of service? How can I help you with the resources and the skills that I have? How can I leverage my resources and my skills to serve and support your vision, your goals, your mission, rather than me telling you what your goals, your mission, and your vision should be? How do we honor people's humanity and their sovereignty rather than engaging in dynamics that create disempowerment, that reinforce oppressive systems, that treat people as though they are less than? They don't need us to fix them, to save them, to solve their problems. They have the capacity and the capability to care for themselves. And we can support them to do that in ways in which they decide and define. And so again, it's like we have to completely restructure the way that we think about ourselves and other people and the dynamics that play in the world. So we don't decolonize the systems, we decolonize ourselves, we decolonize our own minds, our own ways of thinking, our own ways of existing and showing up in the world. We cannot decolonize inherently colonial systems. We have to decolonize the ways in which we have thought that have created these systems in the first place. So the task before us is to decolonize ourselves so that we can decolonize our ways of thinking and moving and being. And again, this is why it's so important that we really get honest with ourselves about the ways in which we have internalized oppressive systems, because it is through our internalization that we recreate and perpetuate harm without knowing that we're doing that. So again, my intention is never to demonize anyone who is operating in these ways of being without conscious awareness. And when I had to confront these things about myself and the ways in which they lived within me, that was really uncomfortable because no one wants to admit to themselves that they have been hurting people that they actually set out to help. But it is only through acknowledging the truth of that that we can do something different. And so, as always, the invitation is to ask ourselves, in what ways have I internalized this discourse around better than and less than? And how is it showing up in my relationships? In the ways that I am moving through the world, in the ways that I am orienting to the world, and how I perceive myself in relationship to others. Because what plays out in my personal life becomes part of collective reality. It shapes the world we live in, not just my own lived experience. And so, to what extent have we internalized these beliefs around insufficiency and lack? And how are we trying to compensate for our own lack of self-love or self-worth by imposing ourselves on other people and taking away their agency and their autonomy and their sovereignty through that imposition? Because again, it is having a ripple impact on our global systems that impact us collectively, not just individually or personally. All right, so I do have a little announcement as well. Next week will be the last week of the podcast for a little bit of time. This is like a very time and energy consuming process, and I have a lot of projects and collaborations in the works and a lot of things I need to focus my energy and attention on. And I also am starting to feel a little bit burnt out from all that the podcast requires of me in the process of producing and creating and sharing it. And so I am going to take a step back for the month of August to give myself a little bit of breathing room to focus on these other things. And so July 30th will be the last episode until September 3rd. So I'll be back on September 3rd. But I will come with another episode next week, July 30th. I think I know what I'm going to talk about, but it could change between now and then. So we'll see. But yes, it felt important to share that information with you that in August I will be taking a break. As always, I love to hear from you. If there are any reflections that you have from this episode, previous episodes, any insights that you've gained for yourself, any questions that have come up for you, please share them with me. I really love to engage with you all and to hear what is this stirring up for you and what kind of reflections and realizations are you having about the world and your life and yourself. And I will see you next week for the last episode before September 3rd.